One of the most popular fantasy stories of the 20th century is C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. Depicting a world full of magical beings and talking animals, those 7 books have resonated with many readers since they started being published in 1950. The germ of an idea first came to Lewis when he pictured a faun in the snow carrying an umbrella and parcels. During World War II, when British children were sent to the countryside to protect them from Nazi bombs, the Pevensey children started to form. The idea of a book would become The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a wonderful fantasy story full of imagination. In the book, the 4 children travel through a wardrobe to the land of Narnia. Peter, Lucy, Susan, and Edmund encounter all sorts of characters, including talking beavers, the evil White Witch who has forced Narnia into eternal winter, and a lion with incredible abilities named Aslan. Lewis did a superb job of setting up this world and giving readers an idea of its history while also developing his young heroes. The most interesting development comes with Edmund, who begins the story as a brat, but we see how his experiences in Narnia change him into a better person. One particularly clever device is the idea that time passes differently in Narnia than in our world. As a result, whenever characters return there, they're thrust into a new world and new challenges and new characters to meet. Lewis did not initially plan on writing any further stories in Narnia when he started. However, he enjoyed writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe so much, he immediately started work on the next book, Prince Caspian. To be honest, I don't find most of the sequels to be nearly as engaging as the first book. There are still some imaginative moments here and there, but they seem to get into a formula. The books would usually revolve around a couple of children who set off on a journey as they hop from place to place, with Aslan occasionally showing up to provide some help. I do think these later books tended to meander and came across as a tad too episodic in structure. I think the best book after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is The Magician's Nephew. I really did like this one as it depicts the beginnings of Narnia and how the White Witch wound up there. There's still a bit of that formula I mentioned, but also a couple of different elements that set it apart. For example, the White Witch is transported to London, and we see the chaos that ensues from this. It's also neat seeing the pieces come together and how the familiar elements were first introduced to Narnia. The final book, The Last Battle, takes a bizarre turn though. Lewis seems to take particular issue with Susan showing interest in things other than Narnia, like makeup and boys. And even though I think he intended the ending to be uplifting, I found it to be a real downer. The Last Battle is considered the most divisive book among Narnia fans, and I can definitely see why. A common debate among fans is what should be the correct reading order. Should you read the Chronicles of Narnia in order of publication, or chronologically? There are many arguments in favor of each, with differing accounts of what Lewis intended. Complicating matters is that Lewis did not write the books in the same order they were published, including The Magician's Nephew being written last. I read them in publication order, and I do think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe serves as the best introduction to the world of Narnia and the principal characters. In the end, it depends on the individual reader. Much has been said about how the series is a Christian allegory. Lewis had strong Christian beliefs inspired by discussions of his close friend J.R.R. Tolkien, and they certainly make their way into the books. For instance, the children who enter Narnia are referred to as the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. Meanwhile, Aslan is obviously inspired by Jesus Christ. The way he's talked about by the animals and the residents of Narnia calls to mind the way Christians talk about Jesus. There's also probably the most famous scene in the books where Aslan is humiliated and killed by the White Witch and is then resurrected. Just to drive the point home even further, there's a part in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader where Aslan tells the children that they already know him by another name back home. The creation of Narnia in The Magician's Nephew has parallels to the book of Genesis, and there's a part where the White Witch tries to tempt a young boy with an apple in a garden. The Last Battle especially goes heavy on the symbolism. An ape creates a false Aslan who he uses to do terrible things, and as a result of this fake deity, others in Narnia stop believing in Aslan, with a group of dwarfs meant to represent atheists. The final chapter reveals that the Narnia we've been reading about all along is not the real Narnia. The real Narnia is instead a heavenly realm where everyone goes when they die. Well, except for Susan, apparently. She has to stay behind on Earth, having by then turned into a rather silly, conceited young woman. That's a direct quote by C.S. Lewis. The Chronicles of Narnia tends to get heavy-handed with the Christian themes, and I have mixed feelings on how they were handled. The popularity of the books meant adaptations were inevitable, although Lewis did not think his stories could be successfully translated to the screen. Many have tried, although they've never been able to get past the first few books. The first adaptation, based on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was produced for ITV in 1967. 10 episodes were made, but very little of the footage is available today. Years later, the Children's Television Workshop produced an animated version of the book directed by Bill Melendez. Airing on CBS in 1979, this became the first Emmy winner for Outstanding Animated Program. It managed to condense the story into 95 minutes and kept largely faithful to the book, with only some omissions here and there. It has its occasional charms and makes the most with the limited animation, although Edmund is given some hilarious facial expressions when he's plotting how to portray his siblings, and the White Witch shouts all of her dialogue. Overall, it's an okay take on the material. Despite pulling in decent ratings and hinting at future adventures, this was the only animated adaptation they made. Starting in 1988, the BBC took a crack at the Chronicles of Narnia with 3 miniseries. The first 4 books were adapted with Prince Caspian and Dawn Treader combined. I watched The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and despite the obvious cheapness of the production, there are things to appreciate. While it looks like it was filmed at the local park, they did use the location well, and I also liked how some of the animals are hand-drawn animated. It does adapt the book faithfully, although maybe a bit too faithfully, as I found parts to drag, especially the later chapters. Meanwhile, Barbara Kellerman is way too over the top of her portrayal of the White Witch, which can come across as unintentionally funny at times, and some of the makeup designs on the talking animals look rather silly. I'm sorry, but I cannot take that beaver seriously. Nonetheless, the production team were working with the budget limitations they had, and so you cannot fault them too much. For years, Hollywood producers had tried to make a big-budget adaptation, although a few wanted to change the setting to the United States. Walden Media eventually got the rights, and thanks to the success of Harry Potter, they faced no opposition to setting the films in the UK. A deal was then set up with Disney to help produce and distribute the movies. Guillermo del Toro was one the directors asked, but he turned it down, as he felt his religious ideologies were different than Lewis's. Eventually, Andrew Adamson, the co-director of the first 2 Shrek movies, signed on to direct. I think he did a really good job of translating The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to the screen, creating an entertaining and epic adventure. The young actors for the Pevensies were well chosen, with Tilda Swinton turning in a memorable performance as the White Witch. She found the right balance to make her evil and diabolical and not going too over the top like previous portrayals. Liam Neeson was also an excellent choice to voice Aslan, who was nicely brought to life by the visual effects team. Adamson chose to film the movie in his native New Zealand with additional shots in the Czech Republic, and those locations helped give Narnia the appropriate scale. The themes and characters of the book were kept largely intact, although there were the necessary alterations. Even though the book only briefly goes into why the Pevensies are at the professor's house, the movie opens with London being bombed, and we get further context for the children and their personalities. In the book, the battle only takes up a few pages, as it largely happens off-screen while Lucy and Susan are with Aslan. Adamson remembered the climactic battle being a lot longer when he read the book as a child, and also recognized that audiences, accustomed to what Peter Jackson did with The Lord of the Rings, would expect to see a big epic battle. While the pacing could have been tightened up a bit, I think Andrew Adamson and the screenwriters managed to deliver a well-done fantasy film with the right amount of magic and wonder, while also properly handling some of the darker themes. The enormous success of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe gave Disney a new franchise, and they enthusiastically approved the next film, Prince Caspian, with Adamson returning to direct. I personally think this film improved on the source material in many ways, making for another epic adventure. The decision to introduce the movie with Prince Caspian's story rather than save it for the middle like the book did was a smart one, and like in the first movie, they expanded on the Pevensies in London before they transported to Narnia. Adamson again expanded the battles from the book and created some well-executed sequences with plenty of action and swordplay. New characters like Caspian, Reepicheep the Mouse, and Trumpkin the Dwarf were well utilized, and the film does a good job of showing the Pevensies trying to understand what's happened to Narnia and getting embroiled in the new political situation. One strange alteration from the book was having Susan and Caspian fall in love. She never comes back to Narnia after this, so unless they were planning to change that in later films, it's a plot point that would not have been returned to. Nonetheless, I think Prince Caspian was able to nicely continue the story of Narnia. The film received a bigger budget than Wardrobe, but did far less business. That led to disagreements between Disney and Walden over the budget of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Disney decided not to release the next movie, so Walden shopped it elsewhere. The other major Hollywood studios showed interest, with 20th Century Fox ultimately winning out. Adamson had already decided to not direct Dawn Treader, with Michael Apted taking his place. Unfortunately, I think the movie is a bit of a step down from the previous 2 entries. I felt it retained some of the problems I have with the book, and became a tad meandering, and the characters were not as fleshed out as they could have been. The one exception is Eustace, the obnoxious cousin who takes the journey to Narnia with Lucy and Edmund. As played by Will Poulter, he becomes an entertaining presence and gets the best and funniest lines in the movie. Poulter does a great job of depicting Eustace's stuck-up attitude, as well as showing how he changes over the course of the story. He's what kept me most engaged through the runtime, which, despite being shorter than the other movies, felt strangely longer due to the languid pacing. The filmmakers decided to create a green mist which threatens Narnia, something which is not in the book, and I found this to be an odd and uninteresting addition. Even though Voyage of the Dawn Treader took in about the same numbers as Prince Caspian, its considerably lower budget meant this film was able to turn a profit, unlike its pricier predecessor. The producers planned to make The Magician's Nephew the next movie, but Walden's rights expired and it never happened. In 2013, it was announced that the Mark Gordon Company had acquired the Narnia rights and would adapt The Silver Chair, but this would be its own thing rather than continuing the Walden films. TriStar Pictures then signed on to distribute the movie, with Joe Johnston serving as director. However, that also never made it to screens. Instead, in 2018, Netflix announced they would partner with Mark Gordon to make both movies and television shows based on the Chronicles of Narnia. Shortly after that, Matthew Aldrich, whose credits include serving as a co-writer on Pixar's Coco, was hired to oversee these new adaptations. However, it's been very quiet since then, and as I'm recording this, there have been few updates about how the Netflix productions are progressing. While The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has had little trouble getting adapted, the later books appear to be difficult to crack. Nonetheless, it says something about how much C.S. Lewis's stories continue to resonate that filmmakers and showrunners keep trying. Whether you view them through their Christian themes or just as fantasy adventures, the world he created was certainly imaginative, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe especially deserves its status as a children's classic. See you next time.